Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am Mr. Samuels, and today we are looking at World War I, Part 1. This is a bigger lesson, so it has been broken into two parts. Our essential question for Part 1 is, how could you describe the early phases of World War I? We're going to start with talking about kind of the illusions and then the eventual stalemate of the war. Now, prior to 1914, many believed that war in Europe simply wasn't going to happen. Politicians would want to avoid it. They would want to focus on the economy. Things were going well. Why mess with a good thing? But soon, the government started to shift how they were portraying the world. And they started to talk about the importance that their nation take a prominent role in Europe, that their nation was bigger, better, more important than others. And we needed to make sure that we positioned ourselves to be the leader of Europe. Now, part of the shift in this comes from the fact that since 1815, almost all European wars had been short. So if we're going to go to war, and if we're confident in our own ability to do really well in that war, it's going to be brief and we're going to be victorious. And so public support shifted. All right, if it's just going to be a 3-week, 6-week war and we're going to win this thing, yeah, sure, let's go to war. So war on the Western Front. When we think about World War I, it's the Western Front that always gets dramatized, always gets focused on the most. Now here, Germany hoped to win the war quickly, and a quick war meant that they would take out France very fast. They did this by crossing through Belgium. So instead of attacking the French-German border down here, they attacked through Belgium, which was more lightly defended, and were not expecting an attack, and invaded France from there. Now, after doing this, they were able to push all the way to the Marne River, which is about 50 miles outside of Paris. So they very nearly succeeded in reaching Paris. But they were stopped at the Marne River, in large part because of this organization of Parisian taxis. The soldiers didn't have enough transport vehicles to bring them to the front line, but there were a lot of taxis in Paris. So they basically hired all the taxi drivers in the city to drive soldiers out to the front line. And this was able to mobilize the French quickly enough to stop the Germans from reaching Paris. Here, the two sides will meet this stalemate. They dug into these trenches that were at first really just kind of ditches, and firing over the top of the trenches at each other. And if anybody tried to go up and over their trenches, they would get shot by the opponent. So they settled into this kind of stalemate in the trenches along the Western Front. And for 4 years, they will be dug into these trenches with very little movement. On the Eastern Front, the war looked a little bit different. There were not as many trenches, certainly there were, but not nearly as many. And the lines of battle shifted around and moved around a lot more. Now, this starts with the Russians, who are slow to mobilize, but do finally mobilize and launch their attacks against Austria. First, those Russian attacks forced the Austrians out of Serbia, the Russian ally that Russia got into the war to defend, and then pushed into Austria itself, taking Galicia from the Austrians. After this happens and Austria starts to look weak against the Russians, Italy kind of shocks the world, and especially the Central Powers, by switching sides. And Italy leaves the Central Powers, joins this new alliance of Russia, Britain, France, and Italy, and attacks Austria, their former ally, in an effort to take some Austrian territory. Now, the Austrians are now in a bit of a pickle. They are losing to the Russians, and Italy is nipping at their heels. The Austrians are looking really weak. But Germany does announce that they are going to stick with their friends, the Austrians. And the Germans are proof that they are a much tougher nut to crack. So in late August, Russia, feeling confident in their war against Austria, shifts their focus to Germany Germany's going to invade Paris. They're going to be focused on the west. All right, Russia can attack them from the east, and they feel pretty confident that a distracted Germany is not going to do very well. But Germany does do very well. They do extremely well in defending their own territory, and Russia will lose two major battles early on, one in late August and one in mid-September. After losing those two major battles, Russia does not have the power or the manpower to attack anymore. They have to shift to a defensive war, but they don't do especially well in the defensive war either. Germans join the Austrians, they push the Russians out of Austria, and just keep pushing them back and back and back deep into Russia itself, losing huge areas of territory and causing the Russians 2.5 million casualties. Now, this practically, although does not actually knock Russia out of the war, it will be another couple years before Russia is fully knocked out of the war. But Russia is now very clearly not a threat to the Central Powers, and the Central Powers can focus their attention again back more on the Western Front. So the Western Front. The Western Front devolved into this series of trench warfare pretty early in the fighting in 1914. By 1915, the trenches are really getting solidified, and by 1916, these trenches are a really elaborate system of forts with trenches as virtual roads leading in between them. The trenches themselves are guarded by fields of barbed wire, and I'm talking fields of barbed wire, stuff that you just really cannot get through without extreme difficulty. As you're trying to get through these fields of barbed wire, you have machine gunners who are firing at you as you go, defended sometimes just by sandbags, sometimes by actual concrete machine gun nests. Makes it very difficult to get through. Now, France and Germany were both doing this. They have trench lines that last for hundreds of miles along the front, connecting every which way to different trench systems, making it really difficult to advance. So difficult, in fact, that the stretch of land in between the two trenches became known as no man's land, because if you went out there, you were going to die. So people did not go out there unless it was an organized mass attack. This is a look out of a trench toward no man's land. You can see strings of barbed wire. You can see explosions from artillery. It's really a mess out there, and nobody went there unless they were being forced. So trench warfare, a little bit more on this. As you can imagine, attacking enemy trenches was a deadly mess and very rarely successful. When they did try, they would use these big artillery guns and land it right in no man's land, using these huge guns to try to blow up the barbed wire mess that the soldiers would have to charge through. Once you fire enough weapons, you break up the barbed wire enough, maybe we can try. So you would have soldiers go up and over. They'd go out of the trenches and charge the enemy lines. But the artillery rarely got the machine gunners, and the machine gunners would just take out anybody charging through. For example, of how bad this was, two different battles. The Battle of Verdun, which was an early battle, 700,000 soldiers died at that battle trying to charge out of their trenches. And then a little bit later at the Battle of the Somme, the deadliest single battle in modern history, 1.2 million soldiers will die. And in both of these instances, we're looking at the cost of hundreds of thousands, million plus lives for the gain of a few miles. It was really a deadly war that could not be won through this sort of attack. So people start to shift their tactics. And one of those was the inclusion of air power in war for the first time. This is the first time it's really being used significantly. At first, pilots are just flying up in the air to get a good look at the opponent and what the opponents are doing. Where are their trenches heaviest? Where are they massing troops? Where might the next attack come? From an airplane, you could look down on that, reasonably safe from most weapons fire. Now, other planes might come up, but these early planes, they weren't equipped with weapons. So the pilots would literally fly next to each other and try to shoot each other with handguns. That was early aerial warfare. but it's not too long before machine guns get mounted onto planes, and they can now fight more effectively with each other and fire at ground targets. The idea being you take out the enemy planes first, and then you sweep down and you can take out some land targets as well. This man right here, Manfred von Richthofen, is the Red Baron. He was kind of the star pilot of the war. This was his plane. He flew for Germany and was kind of the ace pilot in the air throughout the war. Now down here we see a Zeppelin. A Zeppelin is just a big blimp. And the Germans use these fairly effectively early on to just fly them over enemy targets and drop bombs from the blimp onto those targets. But then the British in particular learned how to combat this. These are hydrogen balloons. Hydrogen is really flammable. So if you shoot this huge target with the right type of weapon, the whole thing just explodes into a ball of fire. So Zeppelin use kind of went out of favor pretty quickly after a small number of successful attacks. All right, that is all that we've got for part one. See me next time for part two, where we'll get more into this. I do hope that you learned something today, and farewell.